Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Msingi Talks. I am, as always, honored and excited to be hosting these conversations. Thank you to everybody who always comes back and listens to us. Thank you to people who share our content, our conversations. Today, as sometimes it happens, I'm having a conversation that I really do not want to be having, but I think we need to have. But all of us have been on WhatsApp groups and we've received all the forwards about violence in schools and the fires in schools. We've seen our children. The statistic I have is that 30 high schools in the last 3 weeks have gone up in a blaze, and we all have theories: who to blame, who not to blame, whose fault is it. But I want us to ask ourselves a different question: is why, not whom, but why. And so to ask the questions is me, and I have an able panel of guests, of friends, of people who I would like. I listened to Dr. Oburu yesterday and today, and I was telling her before we came live that I was just in awe of the conversation that she and Dr. Wandia were having. So I am here to learn. I am here to ask questions. I'm here to reflect on why is there so much violence in our country, and why are our youth at the receiving end of most of it. So welcome to my panelists. I will start with Mweni. Karibu sana, and please introduce yourself to the people, who you are, where we can find you, and yeah.
Thank you very much, Carol. It really is an honor to be part of this panel this evening. My name is Mweni Wambua. I do 3 things in this life. I am a pastor, I am a grief therapist, and I'm a ethnicity coach. What does that all mean? It means that I help people navigate changes and challenges of life in a manner that is true to who they are, because we all have different realities, in a manner that protects their dignity, because some of the changes and challenges we go through have a way of stripping us of our dignity, and also in a manner that connects us back to the divine, as we believe the divine to be. So that's really what I do, and I look forward to the conversation this evening. Thank you.
Karibu sana Mweni. Dr. Oburu.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Hilda Oburu. I'm a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. I teach psychology. My interests are mainly in youth violence, mainly because I interact with teachers a lot in the course of my teaching. Thank you for having me, and welcome to this conversation, everyone.
Karibu. Karibu sana daktari. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Yes, Karibu.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, Carol, our fellow panelists. My name is Darius Okola. I'm an economist, I'm a writer and a researcher, and wear many other hats, but they still all pretty much within those 3. Within the economic space, basically, is to help a society grapple with how it organizes its resources and why it organizes them the way it organizes them. I'm glad to be here and to be part of this conversation.
Thank you very much. Please, for all of us who are listening, I know you have so many questions that you want to ask. Please feel free to ask them on a panel. There is Vicky, who's helping us behind the scenes with the questions. There is, you can write your comments. All of them, we'll read them, and we really want this to be very interactive, because this is why we are here. We are here to learn. We are here to talk to each other. My name is Carol Nganga, founder Msingi Trust. Msingi exists to make the connection between faith, social justice, activism, and advocacy. I'd want to share a short video that explains who we are, and then we can go.
What does social justice, activism, advocacy, and the Christian faith have in common? Is pursuing justice at all levels a spiritual discipline? How do we influence church leaders and Christians to advocate for justice and fight injustice? How can churches become the first line of defense for the socially unprotected? Msingi is a movement of people spurred by their Christian faith to answer these questions about social justice, advocacy, and activism. Msingi believes the church can be empowered to redemptively advocate for justice for the most oppressed, for those relegated to the fringes of society, for the disempowered, and those without access to power. In his inaugural sermon, Jesus spoke about those on the margins of society, about their freedom and their liberation. Pursuing justice is at the core of being a Jesus follower. Justice and righteousness is the foundation of God's throne. Msingi's name, call, heart, and bold mission draws from this, holding true to the tenets of God's kingdom. Our faith propels us to seek justice and spend ourselves on behalf of the poor. Justice is their shield and defender. At Msingi, we are about connecting the struggles that we all face. We are creating safe spaces to converse about social justice, curating content that enhances justice conversations, and in this way, uniting the stand for social justice and for advocacy. Engage the content, join in the conversations, connect to the movement. This is Msingi.
Oh, I'm talking and my mic is on mute, but that's us. Karibu to us, karibu to the conversations we host. If you've missed any of our conversations, please feel free to catch up on some a number of them on Facebook. They are stored there. We have a podcast as well, Msingi Talks podcast, where we have quite a number of conversations as well. We offer trainings on faith, justice, and advocacy. So yeah, I want to start with you, Mweni. From your perspective, and when every time you read here about schools on fire, demolitions in Mukuru, Kwajenga, increased SGBV, what questions do you ask yourself based on your lived reality, your profession, and from where you see it as a pastor, as a grief therapist? What do you hear or see that we are not seeing?
You might just jump into it, Carol. No preliminaries. We just jump right into it.
Yeah.
I think for me, when I see the incidences going on in our school, I hear and I see frustration in our children. And I wonder, where is the source of that frustration? What has happened to them? And though so a frustration is actually, it's a primitive human response when we have our essential needs not met. And so when my question then becomes, what are the basic needs that our children have, and therefore what are the needs that are not being met in our children? And this is not to be seen or heard as an indictment to the parents. Remember that the children belong to the society. And so my question is, what kind of society is raising up children that are so frustrated and that have their needs, their basic needs so unmet that they choose to express their needs by burning of schools? That's really what's going on for me. So no, the question is not what's wrong with our children. My question is, what has happened to us that has produced such children?
Asante Mweni. Dr. Oburu, what has happened to us that is producing what we are seeing? What do you see that we are not seeing? What do you hear? What are you sensing?
Every time I listen to a conversation, and it's very mediatized conversation, so it's everywhere, it's in your face, it's wherever you turn, whenever you read, it's everywhere. So I begin to ask myself a few questions. I can tell that something is wrong, but I have to find, where do I look? So I know that schools are supposed, where do children thrive? I ask myself that question, where do children thrive? We know that they thrive where schools, where spaces are safe, responsive to their needs, and where they feel they are nurtured. So I ask myself, where is the problem? Is it the school system? Is it the home? Is it the society? But then as I look around, I realize these dots are connected. Socio-cultural context, the political, the home, the school, all these are connected. So I begin to ask myself, then what can we do? Usually what's on my mind is, what then can we do? How are we unable to nurture children? How are we unable to give children safe spaces until they have to shout literally at us? Because ASON for me is a cry for attention. And then I ask another question. How did children get to hate school so much? Because children will not ban something they like. When you feel you belong, you feel safe, you feel cared for, you will not ban that thing. So I ask, what is it that is not right? How is this environment structured in such a way to create so much anger? That's usually what I'm thinking.
Thank you, Dr. Oburu. Maybe
and I'm hoping that a conversation can rise level to help us figure it out.
Yeah. Dr. Oburu, do children have a right to hate school? Do they have a right to feel? Because most of the reflections and the interactions that I have on this matter is that children are ungrateful. Do they have a right?
Children are not ungrateful. Children are saying something. They are not ungrateful. They are not spoiled brats. If something is not working, children are very expressive. They pay attention to what we are saying. They are very perceptive, and they are creative. So if you create a space where they can't express themselves, you are suppressing their creativity. They look around and they wonder, is this going to work for me? Because it's a reality. One of the things that surprised me when as I was looking at their stories is that there is a reality we have no idea about. And that reality is being an adolescent in the internet age. These children are the only people who understand what that is. And until we hear them, we cannot help. We cannot do our duty of nurturing and bringing them up. So children have a right to tell us, this is not working for us. And they have a right to ask us for help. And we have to step in and help.
Asante, Daktari. Darius, what are you seeing what are you sensing? What are you seeing, feeling based on your background, lived experience, your profession? And what are we not sensing as Wanjiku, as Carol?
I think building up on what Mwene and Daktari have mentioned, these kids can see. And I mean, to just take two critical issues. One of them is the fact that, in my view, we have a very narrow definition of violence in how we've built our social, cultural, and political context. We tend to see the operational violence, the outworkings of violence, if you will, blood and stones and, all that. But there's a certain contradictions that we built into our society that in and of themselves constitute, violence. These kids look at their elder brothers who've been told, stay in school, be disciplined, keep your head low, follow the rules. And then they're looking at their elder brothers and sisters. And as somebody within the economic space, I can tell you we have, incredible, and it's something I think everyone here can bear witness, incredible levels of labor market inefficiencies. They're looking at their elder brothers who stuck to those rules they were given. And then once they're done with Form 4 or they're done with the university, they're told, create your own jobs, hustle your way out. But like you've told us for pretty much 16, 17, 18 years that, keep your head low and the system will reward you. Then they're looking at their brothers who are coming out here and they're living that contradiction of this in the end has not, worked out for them in the way that the cultural narrative sort of pushes out there. And that just being one of the contradictions that we have and these kids can see. And that contradiction, of course, affects their teachers, it affects their parents, it affects their elder siblings. And they also have, in certain ways, to grapple with how their own, elder kinsfolk are grappling with these contradictions. But much more importantly, it's the narrowness of our definition of violence is that it allows us to, sweep so much under the carpet, and in the hope that we don't have to deal with it. So, for example, let's take structural violence, and how we've built it into our systems. I look at something like Ngong Road and how it's been designed. You haven't built footpaths for people. You've, essentially done this kind of very shoddy infrastructural development, and the inconveniences that creates and the risks that creates directly on people's lives. And we've built that kind of essentially structural violence into so many of our systems. We have, I would look at someone who wants to, for example, get, engaged in labor within the government. You have to get these 8, 9 certifications. I'm glad recently our MPs pushed back. But then you're essentially telling them they have to get certificate of good conduct, they have to get this approval, and that approval, even from institutions they never engaged in. And we've seen instances where these institutions and structures are used to delegitimize people who have certain aspirations, when those aspirations do not fit in with, the aspirations of certain clusters and classes, powerful classes within the society. And so all these inbuilt contradictions have a way of eventually playing out. So I tend to look at the fires and the violence as we look at it from the kids' perspective, but also to say it feeds into much more violence that, we've built some level of tolerance for, and all these contradictions catch up with us in different ways. So, for example, we talk about school fires, but how much do we have to say about what happened in Kisumu, with the vice president? Of course, there's a political dynamic to that, but that is violence. Are these kids not watching? They're home, those are adults fighting there. So how are you going to go home and tell these kids, this is wrong, you banned the school, it's wrong. But then they're looking at the rest and say, okay, but the adults were on this also, it's not a whataboutism, it's essentially saying, are we looking at how we've designed our structures of society and the inbuilt violence and contradictions, and how that eventually even plays out with this? Yeah.
Thank you, Darius. As I was thinking about this, and we talked a bit yesterday. Today I woke up and this thought came into my head. It's like, if the system is built violently, it will be violent.
Mm-hmm.
So if economic systems, if our education systems are built for extraction, for competition, the weak versus the strong, and not for social cohesion, it will be a violent situation. But but then is there another way out of violence? Maybe we can explore that further. But Mweni and Dr. Oburu, you have a background in psychology. Maybe you could tell me, or from psychology, from your pastoral background, what is Kenya's psychology of violence? So imagine Kenya is coming to you in your office and you're to diagnose us. What would you diagnose us as parents with, as students with, and as teachers with?
I would begin with looking at who have we become? Who are we, and what is it? What is our manifesting behavior? And then, because to be able to understand our manifesting behavior, it would be important to understand where we are coming from. I would want to look at what is it that has happened to us over time, and from where I stand, I think we can safely say that we are a largely traumatized people. And this is based on the understanding that trauma is not what happens to us. And we tend to think that a traumatic thing is a dramatic thing. And what we need to realize, that trauma is not what just happens to us, but trauma is actually what happens to us as a result of what happens to us. What goes on the inside of us as a result of what we have gone through. And so I would like us to be able to look at what is it that we have gone through as a country over the years. What has been going on? What has shaped our system? What has influenced us? What has spoken about the people that we have become? And so what has that done to us over generations? What has that passed on to us? And because everything that we do today is in response to what the environment and the ecosystem that we exist in is doing to us, and therefore we are simply responding to it. And so, with regard to the question on fires of schools, one of the most common arguments that we keep hearing is that public schools are burning. Why are private schools not burning? And therefore, we narrow it down to that argument. But my question is, the children in the public schools and the children in the private schools all are in the same ecosystem. And therefore, whereas the children in the public schools are burning their schools, what are the children in the private schools burning? Where are the fires in private schools? And so those are the conversations that I would have with you in my therapy room, looking at what happened to you and what happened to you as a result of what happened to you. What needs did you have that were unmet? What needs did you have that were basic needs, human needs, and what happened to them? And what kind of coping mechanism did you therefore have to adopt because of the deficit of the emotional needs that you have?
I feel like I'm in a therapy session because I'm now coming back, and yeah, but we always say, Mweni, that we were beaten and we turned out okay.
Did we?
We didn't burn school.
What did we burn? What are we burning? What are we burning?
Yo, I don't know. Dr. Oburu, we are in your session. What will you diagnose us with? Did we turn out okay? Are we okay? And what Mweni has spoken about, I'm thinking of generations and generations and generations of trauma. So we are carrying intergenerational trauma. We are carrying trauma from the 1800s to now. And we learned how to be silent. We learned to unashikilia na unasonga, accept and move on.
Yeah, as many have said, did we turn out okay? The answer really is no. Because there are lots of other things that are going on, and we are not able to place our finger that this is a result of internalized trauma. We are not able to place the finger there. So if you look at the Kenyan society, you have discussed this sometimes with my students, you will see two extremes. You will see people who are completely passive and unable to even rise and do something about, let's for instance talk about injustice. And then you will find another extreme of violence. Sometimes violence that we can see, sometimes violence we can't see. Where did those two extremes come from? Where did those two extremes come from? We were not raised, look at it this way, we were not raised in the same culture, we are not raised in the same household, but we seem to be having a pattern. Where did that pattern come from? That it traverses the country and almost everyone is reacting in the same way. So there has to be some experiences that are similar. One of those, I would put it down to colonialism and the colonial legacies that we inherited and which we never broke. We continued with them as if they work. That includes even the whole school system. Look at how our school system is structured. We know that there are schools that will do well. We know that there are schools that won't do well, and we seem to accept it. How did we get to tolerate that and accept it and say it is fine? How are we unable to question that? So we just take it in and say, okay, so long as it's, I'm surviving, my children are surviving, so let's just keep moving. But is that okay? Is that the soul of the nation that we want? Is it really what, how Kenya can move on? So what is happening to us is that we are shocked that these children are asking questions. But here is the difference between these children and us. These children, as I said, are the internet generation. So what is happening is you cannot confine their knowledge. You cannot confine their experiences to Kenya. They are interacting with other people who are almost making them question what they are seeing. And that is what we can deal with. And we must rise and think at a higher level and think with these children. It is their experience, and we need to accept that we need to learn from them so that we know how to navigate this responsibility that we have of bringing up the children instead of demonizing them or moving on a path of pathologizing them, saying that, oh, these are just bad elements, that we have to move from that model of pathologizing the children, of saying these children are so spoiled, they're just brats. We have to move from that model and ask, how can we do this better? Can we reconstruct this? Because look at even the whole issue of schooling and examinations and how we evaluate the teaching. The whole are telling me, why can't we wake up and have sports before we start classes?
Mm.
If you were brought up in the other system, you would be, no, you do classes first and then you do sports. But hang on, are they saying something totally wrong? Maybe not. For their reality, it might be something to explore. Because if they think the curriculum is meaningless, as Darius has put it, because now again, we are telling them, we are going, the worst thing I've had this week, and I'm thinking, okay, you should have held on a bit. Universities are going to close. So why are you keeping them in school? If they think that curriculum is meaningless to them, you will see the violence because you're giving them a future that is precarious. They don't know what is there. All right. So they get scared. So that whole structure, that whole environment, the way we've structured learning is inherently violent. And the violence is not justified, because now I'm hearing stories about self-harm. I'm hearing stories about bullying. Those are violences, all of them, right? Almost worked into the system, and we are only talking about fire. There are other things going on. And it's not just the public schools. If the others are not burning, something else is going on. And that violence to me is systemic. And it has to be dismantled for children to feel safe and to feel like they have a future. Otherwise, the frustration continues, the violence continues.
What are the economics of violence? Like we've talked about the psychology of violence, but what if you are to diagnose us, as well as the psychologists have and the teachers have, if you, as an economist, as a researcher in this field, if we came to you and we want an analysis, what would you diagnose us with from that perspective?
Thank you, Carol, for that. Allow me to go a little bit further back. Well, I mean, way further back, depending on how you look at it. And one of them is what you'd call the soul of a nation. Every country has a certain founding principles, whether written down or not, whether good or bad, but they do exist, yeah? And when you go back 1885 or 1892 or 1895 or 1888, depending on how far back you're willing to go, you realize that we started this country as a colonial plantation, essentially, for the Imperial British East Africa. And in a sense, you could say then that Kenya really started as a private enterprise for this very colonial racist infrastructure, this machinery. And there are a number of ways in which they built the kind of colonial economy that sustained them when they were here. And that was through the missionary church, the mission hospitals, and the mission schools. And anything that fell outside of that sort of matrix was considered either illegal or illegitimate, or essentially downright barbaric, as they term it. And so your goal as a Kenyan, through the last 6-7 successive generations has always been to ensure that, you essentially fit yourself within these three dynamics, which are all essentially the big three pillars of the colonial economy, as it were. And with all the violence, of course, that comes with that, there are many things you have to squeeze yourself to fit within the 3% who would essentially survive the violence in this system, and then you'd be rewarded in some form or shape, with state or political power or some form of recognition within the colonial economy, whether you chose to be a traitor, whether whichever way you chose to participate in that colonial economy. And in 1963, we did not reform it. I always say we exchanged the white aristocrats with the black aristocrats, but we kept the colonial logic of that colonial economy intact. We essentially appointed new custodians of the colonial economy, that they looked like us and spoke our language, and they lived amongst us, and their peers and friends and classmates, did not help much, because there's a difference of logic between the natives, the people who lived in this space, and this new cluster, of local elites groomed to essentially perpetuate the logic that had been, behind since 1895 to that 1963, And in many ways, it still manifests even now in this country, because we've done quite some progress. I mean, the 2010 Constitution, for whatever it's worth, and the many other amendments and reforms we've done to our political structures, to our legal structures, to our social structures. But in essence, we've never come around to have a national conversation about what did we inherit and what did it mean for it to exist the way it did, And so you look at the economy, for example, we are a country of about 54 million people. The number of adults is about 30 million. Out of that, according to the state agencies, we about 15 million economically active, essentially employed or in some form of economic sustenance. That leaves you about another 13, 14 million. We also about 20, 29. Let's work with 30 million as a working figure for this conversation, which still falls within the margins of what we have now. Of course, accounting for population increases over the last few years. And essentially what you're dealing with is, if this 14 million, even when you disaggregate for, the retired, those who, voluntarily opt out of economic arrangements, the students in school, you're still left with a very huge cluster who would want to participate, in the economic production, or in some form of economic activity, but they are not able to do that. And in essence, what we have done is that, you've kept such a significant part of your population outside of any meaningful professional and economic sustenance and economic, use of their skills and abilities. And of course, that has huge implications on their, on their own self-sustenance, on their own, mental stress. We know all the economic challenges that go with being outside of the economic, outside of labor production, whatever form that takes for individuals or different clusters. But what then even gets more interesting is the fact that we built the path that was built towards, getting into these hallowed halls, if I would call them, up within the elite structures of economic production, is that it's a very, very classist dynamic. There was a 2018 report, maybe Dr. Guru has interacted with it, which was essentially saying children of the lowest clusters, the lowest percentile, or rather children of the highest percentile are 49 times more likely to make it to higher education than children of the lowest percentile in the same country, 49 times, irrespective, and this does not even account for their, respective intellect, just sheer, happenstance of where these children are born shapes the economic dynamic massively. Middle-class children, are 3 times more likely to make it to the highest levels of education in this country, more than the children in the lowest cluster. Again, by a mere happenstance, not accounting for intellect, you're already dealing with a massive disparity. And of course, we know this higher education, whichever form it takes, comes with a certain level of professional and economic benefits in and of itself, but also part of it built into the fact that they come from certain socioeconomic classes, and that socioeconomic classes come with certain networks and all these, I call it the principle of inherited advantages. Now, there's nothing wrong with belonging to any particular socioeconomic class, but the fact that these small variations in economic classes comes with such a disproportionately huge either advantage or disadvantage for random kids out there is a form of economic violence that we need to account for before it gets to a place where we're going to have now to deal with clear operational violence within our streets out of the frustration of what, and you could say this economic school, the violence that's going on in schools is part of this essentially acting out. So when you look at economic violences acting out at that level, when you look at the fact that about essentially this is a 10 trillion economy, well, forgive me on numbers, it comes to the territory, but this is a 10 trillion economy. You have about 3,000 Kenyans who essentially have hidden anywhere between 7 and 15 trillion abroad, which is almost the size of the Kenyan economy, 3,000 Kenyans. A lot of these resources were looted, including in 2007, where a number of families, barely 100 were able to expatriate about $1 trillion shillings in 2007 alone. I mean, it's part of the Kroll report. These are public information. $1 trillion shillings is 10% of the Kenyan economy. That's twice the size of all the economic activity in Nairobi. Now you begin to think about that, and you see how that system built in and of itself and how it tentacled within the government system, tentacled within the private sector, tentacled within all the other models and units of economic production in the society, and how that takes away from the critical finances and resources we could use to set up public social services that will help us, reduce the margins of disparity between the socioeconomic classes. Then you realize you're dealing with massive, massive economic violence. But as I said, it didn't start yesterday, it didn't start last week, it didn't start the last decade. It's been around for a while, despite our best attempt at putting in certain levels of reforms along the way. Yeah.
So you're basically saying we have around 150 or so years of work to undo. Dr. Obure wants to come closer to a report that you did, and you spent quite a lot of time with Dr. Wandia on I'm trying to remember Dr. Wandia's channel. It's Maisha Kazini, yeah. So, and you talked about that report. Could you tell us why you decided to venture into that report? What came up for you? What surprised you the most? Yeah, just something around that, and then we can delve deeper into that report.
Yeah. So I looked at I looked at the school fires, but I narrowed it down to boys' schools. Why? Because they burnt more around that time when I was looking at the school violence. Why I looked at it is I wondered whether this was unique. Was this is this school violence uniquely Kenyan? So when I looked further, and then I discovered that school violence has existed as long as schools have existed. All the years, I mean, so long as you had schools, you had school violence. The difference is that it would take different forms. And that would mean it takes a form based on what is the socio-cultural context. So while you would have gun violence in the Western world, you have bullying and suicides in Asia, but in Africa it was now a mixed bag. But Kenya, it became unique. The violence that we see, that is mediatized, that is talked about, takes the form of fires. But then when you think about the fires, you begin to ask, why fire? Why arson? And then I realized that this is something that has gone on for so long, too long. And so I went to look at the pattern. And then I realized, okay, so we've had fires. This is how we look at it. We look at what are the causes. We suggest solutions. Now the implementation is another thing. Okay. So I wondered, when we look at the solutions, when we look at the causes and solutions, do we really address the root cause? And at that point, I realized, let's find out from the people who actually experience it. So I went to talk to the teachers, to the students, and the parents. And that's when I realized that unless you solve what I'm calling structural systemic problems, this will go on. Because when you look at even how we have been handling the problem, it's the same story all through. This, it's the other. And then we make solutions, and this solution, we suggest this is a solution, and the solutions seem to want to cut, we want a solution that cuts across schools. But schools are small systems in their in their own way, right? So one school will be having this problem, the other school will be having another problem, the other school will be having another problem. And I wondered what really is the problem. The problem to me, as I see it now, is the school climate. There are some school climates that will make violence almost natural. It will happen. And then there are those schools that try to reduce the violence. Up to this point, I am thinking the way to go about this is, let's see, how do we create school systems that really work for children? Because clearly what the children are saying, it's not working. What are these environments? And what surprised me is that we haven't ever thought about it. What are these environments that make this violence likely? And there are several striking things you will see in this environment. They are unresponsive to children's needs. I was hearing stories of we asked for this food and we were told we should just eat this. So you have to ask yourself, what is wrong with children asking for better food? How is it that we ask for better food? We have improved our own lives. We want our homes to be okay. You don't want to eat skuma every day. So when the children ask for the same thing, what is wrong with that? And we have to ask what our commitment is to bringing up children, what our commitment is to creating spaces where children actually thrive, where they are nurtured, where they enjoy schooling. So I can tell Kenyans today that children are saying, we are tired. It's not enjoyable. And yet schooling is supposed to be fun and enjoyable for children. Why have we not done that? So that the school environment, the school climate is problematic. One of the other things you would notice is the way we do not connect policies and what we see in the end. So for instance, you say you want 100% transition to high school. That's fine. In terms of equity, justice, that makes sense. But are there systems that can help this 100% transition happen? Not really. So you send children to high school and the numbers balloon. The dormitories are small, but you will ask the teachers to take care of children and to make sure that schooling works. The trouble is when there are too many children, this is what happens. The administrators and the teachers detach. So the children they look at the children as some work we have to do. So what they do is they have to take very militaristic methods of controlling the children because they are detached. So the school system, this policy, a good policy, in the end, ends up creating an environment where there's humanization. And once that happens, violence is very likely to happen. So we have to look at the whole system and how it connects and creating better environments where children can actually thrive and grow into adulthood and where they don't feel, they don't perceive injustice and unfairness. That's very important as schools stand now.
Asante Daktari. Mweni, I don't know about you, but when you hear what Dr. Oburu is saying versus when you hear the discourse from people who for real should know better, I think, who say that it's the Kababa and Kamama generation, it is because I remember who said there was one, I think a politician who said that we love our children too much at home. That's why when they come to school, they cause riots. As if loving children is a crime. Like, so don't love them so that then we can manage them properly at school. we blame parents, and I'll come back to we blame teachers, we blame everybody. What would you say to parents and to teachers who are being blamed for the delinquency, that hard English word, of the children? It is as a result of teachers have become lazy and parents have loved their children too much. Na hawachapwi, let's introduce the cane. Let's beat children.
Carol, I think it is important to acknowledge that we live in a society that largely denies human developmental needs, does not even understand them, and forget about even trying to make any effort in meeting those developmental needs of the human being. And so we have created a society that completely fragments the human being. So we have a situation where when we go to the government institutions and when we are dealing with what we call government, whether it is, the structure that we have in the state, that, whether it is parastatals, whether it is the facilities that we have, the schools, the government hospitals, all the government installations tend to create an us versus them kind of fragmentation. So we are civil servants and we serve them. But we are not even going to begin having the conversation on how uncivil some of our civil servants are. And so we find that we then have a situation where we have government and the people. And so we have system and the people. And so system, one of the things that, and I know this because it is a conversation, it is something that is taught in one of our disciplinary colleges where when they are being trained, they are told, tunawatoa uraia, tuwaweke usystem. We are removing from you being a civilian so that we can install a new system. Now, that is that whole statement is a thesis study. What does that mean? What does it mean to remove uraia and put system in you? But then when we go to government is raia versus system. And so we move from there. We go to our schools. Our schools, we are told, do not bring your heart here. We just want your brain. And so we are dealing with the brain in the school. We don't want heart. We just want the brain. And then we go to our churches. Our churches say, do not bring the brain here. We only want your heart. We are not ministering to your brain. We don't even want to minister to the flesh. Those are works of the flesh. Leave the flesh at the door. In fact, we even talk about how evil the flesh is in the church. And then we go to school and we tell our children, leave your heart at home, leave your flesh at home. We just want your brain. Okay. And then we go to work, and at work, depending on how high up you are, at some levels we are told, here, do not bring anything else. We just want your head, But then also depending on how low you are in the food chain, in the workplace, we are told, here, we don't want your head. We only want your heart. Sorry, your hands. We don't want anything. Just do what you're told to do. We are not paying you to think. And so when at the end of the day, you find that we are dealing with fragmentations of human beings in all the different spaces. And it doesn't end there. We go to our homes and you find that as a woman in the home, I am not expected to bring my mouth at home. I'm not expected to bring my brain at home. I'm simply expected to bring certain parts of my body to be available at home, and also the man. The man is supposed to bring certain parts of his body, including and especially the wallet. And so you find that every part of us, we are being fragmented. We are living lives that are very compartmentalized. So my question is, what part of our society brings us whole? What part of our society looks at as the big picture? And we must, when we're having the conversation about schools in this country, I mean, one of the things that we must ask ourselves is, why do we send children to school in Kenya? What is the purpose of sending children to school? Because then we must begin to ask ourselves, okay, so we send children in school because we want them to become, we want them to do, this is what we want our children to become. This is what our children to learn. This is who we want our children to become once they have gone through the education system. And so my question is, okay, so we are saying we know what the outcome is. What are we doing to give us the outcome that we want? And so what is the system doing to promote and nurture and cultivate the outcome that we want? So we want to raise a human being that is dignified, that is respectful, that is disciplined, that is orderly, that is creative. But how are we doing that? By stripping them of dignity, by crushing their creativity, by shattering their ambitions, by compartmentalizing them and telling them, pathologizing them. And so my question is, we have planted pineapples. And so we are feeling, you know, when you go to a pineapple plantation, it has thorns at the top. So we are walking in the garden and we are feeling the thorns of the pineapples that are now beginning to come up. But we are looking up and wondering, where are the pineapples we planted? You know, and so we are completely disconnected from the awareness that what we are seeing today is a manifestation of a seed that has been simmering over the years. And so we must go back and ask ourselves, where is the one place that the Kenyan soul is reconnected, where we stop this fragmentation of human beings?
I don't know where that is. Dr. Oburu, Darius, do you know where that is? Where is that place?
I'm also looking for it. I'm looking for it. My best hope is a school system that pursues systemic justice. I think that's the best hope, that pursues systemic justice. Where children know, I will go to school, I'll be creative. I will go to school, I'll play. I'll go to school, I'll have friends. I'll go to school, I'll be human. That's my best hope. And that's something we must put our hearts, as Kenyans, put our hearts to it, put money where our mouths are, and really restructure the system so that children can thrive. At least we must work on one generation and make sure that we break the chain of this compartmentalization.
Carol, let me just say this. There's something that Darius was saying that, and you also alluded to it. You said that where we are at, if we begin to look at what has happened to Kenya, we will go back and keep going back and keep going back. And there's probably going to be no end to how far back we will go. And I think we need to change the conversation that we are having now about school fires, because currently the conversation and the direction this conversation seems to be taking among those that are having it, at least we are grateful that we are actually having it, but the direction of this conversation is around who is to blame. Who do we blame? Is it parents? Is it teachers? Is it children? But unfortunately, that conversation is not really helping us. And we must also come to the place of knowing that we can come to a place where we say we are taking responsibility for the school fires, because it is possible for us to take responsibility without apportioning blame. Taking responsibility is to say, this is where we find ourselves. How do we then say it ends with our generation? How then do we say we have seen the last of school fires, and therefore this is the way we are going to operate from now henceforth? Because to say it is the Kababa and the Kamama generation is first of all, it's an insult to our children. But before we begin to say it's an insult to our children, it's an insult to ourselves as people, because what we are saying is that loving our children is bad for them. How is that possible?
Yeah.
How is it possible that we have come to believe that children who are loved and nurtured and catered for and are listened to and they are embraced and their needs are being met and are being considered and are being protected, and we are in an environment, we are providing an environment that is providing safety and security and identity for our children, and that is a bad thing, and that we need to take those away so that we can raise strong children. My question is, what kind of a society is looking to raise strong children? What is a strong child?
When the other day, I was thinking, I think maybe we are envious that the children after us, or the ones behind us, the generations behind us, one, are loved because we never experienced love. Two, they have a voice and that we can use it. Our voices were silenced, and that they have options. I think we are envious of the choices that our children have. Maybe we can think about it. But when we are answering about the soul and where the soul is whole, I want to talk about privatization of education and whether that has any role to play in the mess that we are in. One, Dr. Oburu talked about, I think you talked about the policies of, no, was it Dr. Oburu Mweni, on 100% transition, and then nothing is changing, and that 100% transition is only for the public schools. And I keep thinking on the new of young students who've scored 380 marks from poor families, and they're still outside. They've not gotten into schools, even though there's 100% transition rate. But then also, school is business. And so school has become business. Education is business. Can the soul become whole when we really do not care for the soul, but care for the profit?
I think there's a space for the Kenyan adults to begin to love themselves. I think there's a fear among adults, we, the parents, the elders, to begin to grapple with what it means to be who we are, and this regimen that was supposed to define what Dr. Wandia calls the tyranny of the 3%, and to begin to say there's a cultural goal, and there can be a cultural goal, and there can be cultural aspirations that can lead to wholesome lives outside of trying to fit within the logic of the tyranny of the 3%. That you have to, do all it takes, break all the rules if need be, as long as you are able to fit within this path, then the state will somehow guarantee you certain, leeways and certain privileges along the way. And failure to meet or to fit within that tyranny of 3% comes with a whole bunch of accumulated disadvantages along the way. I think that cultural goal, it's silent, but it feeds into a lot in how we handle our country, in how we define who becomes a winner and who loses and why we think A lost and B didn't. And in a sense, part of that means beginning to break that cultural sort of ideal, some sort of a version of the Kenyan dream, and begin to say there's a way to live wholesome, successful lives outside of it. The challenge with that is that it will come with a whole lot of catharsis for the elders in this country, for anyone who's already gone through that system. And I don't think catharsis is comfortable for anyone, whether as an individual or as a group. And especially if we've not been at a space where, we provided this adult population, either through arts, through the literature, through music and all that, with the tools to be able to, essentially grapple with whether the dynamics, the logic that we followed along the way was good enough to allow us to live wholesome lives. And I think the space for that, I think it will take a lot of courage at individual, but also at, within clusters. And getting into that space is what will then begin to allow us as a people, as a country, to begin to say, maybe the tyranny of the 3% is not all it's cranked up to be, or if it is, maybe it works for certain clusters and maybe that is good enough. But then there are certain ways of living and doing and interacting that can fit outside of that, that are equally valid within this ecosystem or this country or this society that we live in. But as I said, a very simple thing. Growing up, I think one of my best stories in primary school, I think it was class 5 or 6, there's a story about the Nkalimeva. And the Nkalimeva is this animal that was, essentially was eating livestock at night, and nobody figured out which animal it is. They would set a trap, it would evade the trap. Then finally, they were able to put a good trap that caught the animal. But then before they could, catch the animal, one of the villagers was a bit overzealous and ran ahead of it. And before the trap could actually catch this animal,
Darius, you muted yourself.
So that this animal essentially ran away, and because it realized that there were traps set up in the community, it never came back. And because it never came back, nobody was ever able to figure out which animal it is. So the Nkalimeva, which is an animal that really no one knew, so they gave it that name. And I used to grapple with that story because for me, it was one of the few stories I encountered in 844 that really did not end with what is the moral of the story. It's a story that leaves you to imagine all kinds of things, to let your imagination run in all kinds of ways. What was this kind of animal? Was it two-legged? Was it four-legged? Did it, and that is the beauty of how we tell stories outside of what is the moral of this story. And in essence, those kinds of tools allows you to have to grapple with the bizarre, to grapple with, the interesting, to grapple with things that don't have easy and ready-made answers, such that in the end, we don't wake up tomorrow and simply start saying, oh, it's the Kababa and Kamama. Like, where is the space for problematization within the adult imagination in Kenya? Where is the space for sitting with an issue long enough to say and to be comfortable in saying, we don't have answers at this point, but we can begin to look. We don't have answers at this point, but there are enough places to search, in terms of what others have done, or even within our own society and within the wide spectrum of our imaginations. So I think it's, where is the space for the Kenyan soul, and to, essentially, where is the value for the soul in the Kenyan society? It will have to come from the imagination that first and foremost stays away from the tyranny of the ready-made answers. It has to come from a space where we're willing to grapple with things, even when the conclusions are not what we wanted or what we liked, or even when you don't have conclusions. Some of these cultural questions, play out over 20, 30 years. Are we willing to sit with some of these phenomena and grapple with them step by step as they unravel and get answers as we go, and equip the society to be able to be comfortable in that as it builds itself? But most importantly, is the society and is the culture willing to begin to, essentially say everything has to be geared towards the human? how we design our roads, how we design or reform our economic systems, how we design our political systems. Are we ready to begin to say we have to put the human at the center? The Kenyan soul at the center, the Kenyan child at the center, the Kenyan woman at the center, the Kenyan man at the center. And when you have the Kenyan soul at the center of it, then say, can we then begin to build our infrastructures to reflect this person? And that's why I remember as I started this conversation, I said, when you design a road without footpaths or cycling paths, that's violence in and of itself. There's a social technical dimension to our infrastructure development. And infrastructure here covering everything: public schools, hospitals, roads, water, and the drainage services. Can we begin to grapple with the social technical dimensions of these things, keeping in mind that it's the human soul, it's the human being at the center of it all, and every other consideration is built to ensure that you optimize the life of these people that you claim are actually citizens of this country. That's what I think.
Thank you, Darius. The human soul in the middle. I think one of the places that remind me daily that Kenya does not belong to people is the Ngara roundabout. As you're coming from Ngara and you realize that 1, bottleneck, 2, no absolutely where for people to walk, 3, it's just a mess as we're going in. And so as I was listening to you, Darius, I keep thinking, oh my gosh, I am an optimist, but when can this ever happen? As we are thinking for those 30 years, what happens in the middle? What happens to the children we birth now? As we are thinking and as we are planning, so do we say, let's make do with what we have, with the mess we have as we are going?
Okay, I think just a quick one. When you, for example, look at Nairobi, for example, and I'm having this conversation with one of the people involved in the planning. And one of the critical mentions, for example, was some of the bypasses we are building to ease congestion in this country were in the 1973 plan. There have been conversations that, for example, the second port we are building was in the 1987 plan. So it's not a want of brilliant minds and hearts to put these things together. It's the space where we are willing to develop the political goodwill to begin to set up what we've already put on paper, because we have good ideas in this country. We are never short of good concepts and good ideas and good strategies. And so, for example, when you look at, good mention of CBD, you look at how we designed Nairobi, you basically have 5 exits, basically entrances and exits. And that was a security dynamic for the colonial enterprise. And they set it up that way to ensure there aren't that many roads you can come into the city without them keeping surveillance. So you build this infrastructure with more surveillance than human is in mind, And so by the time you're coming to 73, you're saying, no, we've been 20 years into, this new self-determination or whatever we call it. Then we can begin to rethink how we built our capital city. Can we have bypasses? Can we ensure that you don't have to, pass through CBD if you're moving from one side of Nairobi to the other? But then if we are able to hasten implementation, because all these ideas and many other brilliant ideas across spectrums, education, agriculture, infrastructure, you name it, they are on paper. But then if we are able to fast track, the implementation towards building a humane society, that would help on that. And just to be clear on the idea of the 30 years, as I had mentioned, it's not just to wait for 30 years. It's saying some of these things unravel over long times, but in between, in every 6 months to a year, there's a change, there's a transition along the way. So the full spectrum of it might take a decade or 2 or 3, but in between these transitions, are we willing to be intentional enough to be able to ensure that we are optimizing how we're doing them, whether it's putting up new public social services, new schools, new hospitals, hastening some of the projects and procedures that we have as a country across the spectrum. So I mentioned 30 years as an example, but some longer, some shorter. But that's how long a lot of these cultural and social phenomena are travel. But then they have all these, phases in between 6, 8 months, 10 months, where you're able to come back to the process you're on, the journey you're on, and say, okay, this is where we are at on this journey. What have we been able to do? How have we been able to account for it? And then are we still on the path that we set out to as a country and as a people? Yeah.
Thank you for laying that out so well. Dr. Oburu, as you and I were chatting on this topic, you shared that one of the things you really would like to sort of have us learn or have us think about differently is the need to move away from zero tolerance, the pathological criminal justice model of looking at youth behavior. Why do you feel like that's important? That's very important.
Yes, because the reason you have a lot of violence is because of the way we look at young children, the way we look at adolescents. When they do something, we have interesting explanations, and those explanations stop conversations. They stop us from engaging with the problem in a deeper way, at a higher level, in a more intentional way, in a way that centers the child. Because if you are discussing school files and all you keep saying is the children who are burning are Baba, Mama, it is children from single homes, it is children who are on drugs, you have already labeled them, and it is difficult to move from there, because what you've told the society is we have an answer. What's the answer? Exclude them. And does exclusion help? It doesn't. Or bring in the criminal justice system, right? Punish them. I'm sure you've had that. Throw them in jail. You pathologize, the individualistic model of looking at the problem instead of looking at all the other elements that make this possible. So when you do that, we call it something like using tropes. When you use tropes, you direct people into thinking in a certain way. Remove them, jail them. And sometimes I ask, look at arson. Arson is a very faceless crime. You can bring in the criminal justice system, and then you bring the children to court. And then the lawyer will ask, okay, did anyone see them? So the evidence is so circumstantial. You can see how these cases go forever. They keep going forever. They keep going forever, and finally, really no. So moving away from that model will help us think about how to modify behavior, how to help children manage their own behavior in a better way. The other reason we have to move away from zero tolerance is because the teenage brain is growing. It has not reached the level of the abstraction we are trying to make these children engage in. The teenage brain, one of my favorite authors says, it's a Ferrari without brakes. So it will keep moving, thrill, it will seek thrill, it will do what? I mean, all teenagers, if you think about your own self, you engage in behaviors. Today you look back, you're thinking, what was that exactly? It was just the brain. Finally, it grows. I mean, all the children who engage in bad behavior don't end up as, criminals. That it eases out and they grow, especially the prefrontal cortex, it grows. So what's our role? Our role is not to pathologize, to criminalize, to jail them. Our role is to guide, intentionally guide children, try and help them with those breaks. Their brain is moving and they see things in black and white. That's how they see it. This level of functioning where adults are able to weigh options, wonder about consequences, they haven't reached there. So when we criminalize and say, you saw the story of Isikie, what does it, your children will be given a criminal record early, how do you do that? their children. We have to move away from that model and engage in a more positive, culturally responsive way of helping children manage their own behavior. Because that's a more productive way of looking at children. If a child is able to manage their own behavior, that's a nice thing. What do? Intentionally train them. And that's a lot of work. It will take time. Yeah. In fact, we don't even expect parents to do it because, as I always say, empathy for the Kenyan parent. Nobody has children and is given a manual. So you can keep pointing fingers at the parent, and the parent is looking at you and wondering, okay, now what do I do? We have to intentionally do this job, whether through the school system, whether through creating the support system. As I keep saying, the Ministry of Education can not keep talking to us about counselors in school, and those counselors are teachers who are too busy, who are so bogged down with work to do the job. We have to actively create this support system in every school where children are assessed, you track the behavior. There's a mechanism that says this child is at risk, try and help. Okay, we have to really do that and stop criminalizing children and saying we are putting them in prison with a not fully grown brain. We can't do that. We have to be more supportive. We have to be more intentional in training them how to manage their behavior.
Asante Daktari. Mweni, how do we discipline? How do we modify behavior? Because as we are talking, is that we understand that there's a role that adults in the lives of the children play. How do we have an imagination of nurturing children that is violence free? If we don't, how do we get it? Is it possible to nurture without violence or grow without violence? How do we, of course, there's need for correction. How do we correct? What do we do when it's 13-year-old Carol who's stealing from her mom and has been doing so for a while? How do we discipline?
Thank you, Cara. That's a good question. And before I forget something that Dr. Oburu was talking about in terms of the perspective with which we view our children. As we've been having these conversations, I had seen this report a while back, and this is a report that was done in 2017. When 2016, we had a period of July to August when we had a lot of school fires. And so there was a study and an assessment that was commissioned to find out what is going on with our schools and why our schools are on fire. And shock on me that the commissioning of this report, of this study, was given to the National Crime Research Center. That's the angle with which we went to research fires in schools. The National Crime Center, and this is a country that is full of educators, sociologists, psychologists, psychiatrists. They were not part of the assessment. And so I looked at the questionnaire and the people that were interviewed, we asked children, what kind of parenting are you receiving? They don't have capacity to know to assess the kind of parenting they're receiving because they've never had any other experience other than the parent they have. So you're asking them to assess something that they don't have capacity to assess. And so we really need to find a place to begin when we begin to have these conversations about our children. And so back to the question you asked about, Carol. One of the things that we are hearing a lot of is return the cane. In fact, one of the things that we are saying is even the Bible says. spare the rod and spoil the child. But allow me to quote two passages of scripture. Proverbs 13:24 says, whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. And then we have Proverbs 22:15 that says, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far away. Now we must begin to ask ourselves, when the Bible refers to the rod, what does that mean? Yeah. Now, when we go back to the Bible, another place where we see the rod being talked about is in the 23rd Psalm, where we see your rod and staff protect me. And so we realize that a rod in the biblical context was a symbol of authority. And in the context back of the shepherd and the good shepherd in Psalms 23, the rod is actually to guide the sheep in direction. In Psalms 23, we have a shepherd that had both a staff and a rod. Now, a rod was actually made of wood, and it was simply a long piece of stick. And then we have the staff. Now, the staff was actually made of metal. And so the staff had a pointed end, and the staff was not used on the sheep. The rod was used on the sheep. The staff was used to protect. The rod was for correction. The staff was used to fight the enemy. And because of the pointed end, if an animal, let's say a lion, comes to attack the flock, the sheep, the shepherd would use the staff to literally kill the attacker. But on the sheep, the shepherd uses the rod. The rod is about rescue the sheep, stop the sheep from going astray, guide it back to safety. It was not used to beat up the sheep. So when we say spare the rod and spoil the child, it is to understand that we are supposed to use the rod to guide them into safety, to find how to lead and teach them and train them and show the child direction that is correct and not veering away and not going astray. And so one of the things, and I like this a statement that Dr. Mukolwe, one of the leading teachers on parenting in this nation, says is that you can choose when to have children. You can choose how to have children. You can choose where to have children. You can choose if to have children, but you cannot choose when to raise them up. There is a window that is open when it is time. When you have had children, they need to be raised within the window that is open. Now, psychology tells us that in the years between 0 to 17, anything that happens to a life of a child in the years 0 to 17, we even have parameters in what is called adverse childhood experiences. And so we must look at, we need to be able to understand what's happening to the life of a child between 0 to 17 years. What are the experiences that are going on in the life of a child? And as a result of those experiences that are going on in the life of this child, how are we then helping them navigate those experiences and develop healthy coping mechanisms? Because guess what? Life sometimes happens. We can bring up our children in the safest of ways. My husband and I, your husband and you, as a mother, as a father, you can bring up your children in the safest of ways. And then one day tragedy strikes and both of you die in a road accident. You know, life happens. And so those children, even though they have been nurtured in a certain way, trauma comes upon them. And remember what we said is that trauma is as a result of what happens to us because of what happens to us. And so now you begin to see that discipline is not an event. And that is what is going on with the current conversations that we are having. We are looking at discipline is the one thing that is going to sort out all the issues that pertain to this child. I like what Dr. Oburu says. The brain of a child is not yet fully developed until they're about 25 years old. You know, and so because we are talking about a child whose brain is not fully developed, we're talking about a child that needs nurturing. We still need to remember that a teenager is not a small adult, a teenager is a child. And therefore, what is our role as parents in nurturing this child and teaching them the ways of how to manage and navigate life? We begin to have age-appropriate conversations about what discipline is, that they can understand at the level they are in. And so at the different stages, we need to begin to see what's going on in the life of this child. How are they engaging with the world? What is the issue that is coming? How do I mitigate that? And that cannot happen with a stranger. And so we need to look at because unfortunately, many of the way in which our society has been structured, our discipline is not a continuous process from the time a child is born. Our discipline is always a reactive thing. So they have done something wrong. We discipline until next time they do something wrong. You know, and literally discipline, bigger, or deny, take something away from them until they have done something wrong again. And then we come in and do that. But we must begin to ask ourselves, how can discipline be created and structured in such a way that it is continuous learning? Because discipline actually comes from the word disciple. So what kind of a child are we raising? What kind of a disciple do we want? When you become a parent, you begin to we have visions for our children. We have all sorts of visions for our children. And by the way, big, grand visions. We begin to we open a savings account and begin saving for their education. We begin doing all these things when our children are born. And we begin to say, this is the kind of child I want. But my question is, if this is the kind of child that you want, what are you doing now so that 20 years from now, they will be that kind of a person? As one of the communities in Kenya says, ugali comes from unga. You know, what we are putting in is what is going to show up. So what is our life looking like? What are we doing daily, continuously, but also more, and this is not, again, a blame-storming conversation, but we must also begin to ask ourselves, who are we, even as we are parenting our children? Many of us were nurtured in pain. And many of us were not, and it comes back, it shows in the conversations that we are having. When we raise children with love, they become spoiled. And so we believe that we need to have a negative motivation so that our children do not grow a big head or become too soft or become spoiled. And so it comes back to that as well. And so we want to be able to give our children negative feedback so that they will have a positive income. Isn't that ridiculous when we think about it? Don't show them that you love them so that they can become loving individuals. Don't show them that they deserve dignity so that they can become dignified. I mean, really, we must ask ourselves, what is it that we are doing? But we must also realize that discipline is about learning and not about infliction of pain. Discipline is about creating a system that facilitates growth and understanding of why we do what we do.
Yeah, I see the time, but there's a few questions so I'm begging maybe 5-10 minutes of your time, my fellows, because there's a few questions that have come up that I really want us to reflect on. There's a question, Dr. Oburu, that I'd like you to answer, but we are not listening to our kids when they speak. What will it take to get the family guardians to evolve and actually put their children first above the system? You can give a quick answer to that if that's possible.
I can. I've talked to parents, so I'll talk from the point of view of what the parents say, because this question always comes up but you're not doing what you should do. What parents say is, one question that I get very often is, what can I do? You see, if someone is asking you, what can they do, then it means there is need for training. There is need for a support system that actually parents are committed to bringing up children. So the story that Kenyan parents don't want to bring up children really is not very correct. Parents are committed to bringing up children, but the capacity, if you tell them, if say they've grown up with a cane, but now you're telling them it's not really working, it doesn't work, it's not right, the question is, what then can I do? And my answer to this is, can we have a support system where this is deliberately done? Actual active things that really work when you're modifying behavior. The way you're saying so-and-so has been stealing and been stealing for a long time, what the parent knows is to beat up. What then can you do? A support system. I do not, this is not an easy answer. It's a difficult thing. How do you get to support parents? Maybe that's where we need to actively invest in. A parent, you know, like a resource where a parent would ask, this is the problem I have now. How can I work through it? So you equip them with knowledge so that they bring up the child in a better, safer way. A support system for parents.
Yeah, I remember listening to the conversation that you and Dr. Wandia were having, and we were like, go easy on the parents, go easy on the teachers, because they are working in systems that are not conducive. And so how then do we make those systems conducive? And I'm wondering, maybe the Nyumba Kumi for parenting for teachers would help. There's a question for you, Darius, on so what is the arrangement regarding the proposed privatization of Kenyan prisons, and is there any correlation between that and our current educational system?
I mean, when it comes to conversation, especially on privatization, both of prisons, but also of the many other facets of society. And I know we've had this conversation, I think in 2018, if not earlier, about privatization of prisons. And it's not worked elsewhere where this has been practiced. You look at the prison industrial complex, as they call it in the US, and what that eventually led to this kind of dynamic where because you're treating those who have been put in these penitentiaries and the jail system, the penal systems, as essentially potential labor, then there's this motivation that's developed within countries that have a privatized prison, such that there's a motivation to drive anyone, even people with minor offenses, that, can easily be let go with, a warning by a police, or, light sentences, they're, expedited into the court system. And from there, the lengthiest possible sentences are issued, with, of course, at the back of their mind, knowing that the longer we can keep them here, the more they're able to provide us with essentially indentured labor. It's a slavery system. And of course, in some of these countries, there's a racial dimension to it. It's a very, very risky dynamic to want to put a prison, rather profit motive to some of these, you'd almost call sacred aspects of society, the public social services, if we could include, the security component, and of course, the prison system being part of the security system. Of course, the others being hospitals, schools, water services, drainage, roads, and access. There's a very, very huge risk when you begin to put a profit motive to those facets of society, and especially given that how that dynamic has played out in the other facets of the public social services system, but also specifically from the examples around the world, how that has worked, to undermine entire societies, and I mean, if I again back to the US as a good example, it's a totally horrible idea. I wouldn't, advise for it. The idea of a profit or an economic benefit out of it does not outweigh the grotesque motive and how it rips up the entire society. You're going to have some of these younger people who essentially need simply guidance and direction put in the system given 3-6 months. They end up with a criminal record, which means already from the start, you've ensured that there are certain professions, there are certain fields that they will not be able to partake or to participate in because there'll always be a criminal record. And so even in reference to how they brought it up as part of saying, if your kids are striking, we're going to put them into some database and ensure that they'll never get jobs in the future. It's such a plantation mindset. I don't know who are these we put in power, but anyway, there's no space for that kind of madness in a healthy society. There are many ways. These kids are young, they're learning. They're teenagers. You want to channel that energy into useful means. In spaces where they're acting out, you want to know why they're. I mean, others act out in this country all the time. Have you seen how we drive? I mean, we do these things all the time, and nobody's threatening to put us in some criminal database somewhere. And in a sense, so why do we think this very harsh punitive policy should affect our kids? Who are teenagers basically. And yet others are out here living out that same dynamic. And somehow it's supposed to be the norm, more acceptable to some degree, for the adult population. So there is no space for profit motive in a lot of these public social services. And among them, prison is one that should be totally ring-fenced from that kind of, very capitalist, profit-driven kind of a motive, knowing the ripple effect it can have through the judiciary, through the security system, and through the communities around us. Yeah.
Asante, Darius. I know there's a few questions that we had put out that we will not have time to answer, but I'd like us, Mweni, your closing comment. But you could tell me as you're closing, what's the battle and the hope for the Kenyan soul, and a closing comment. You are muted.
Sorry. I will begin by saying and making a declaration that I'm a woman of faith, and therefore I believe that all is not lost as we stand. But for us to be able to know and experience the truth that sets us free, as the Bible tells us, we must be able to have the difficult conversations that allow us to be able to identify the lies that bind and blind us. And so we need to realize that it is important for us to stop looking for quick fixes, and therefore stop looking for easy, neat answers that we will tie down and say, okay, now we have finished the conversation about home fires. We can close this box and we can close this file neatly, put a ribbon on it and say, we have found a formula for raising children. We need to realize that our children are individuals. Even if you have 4 of them, it is not necessarily one parenting style, one parenting approach, one discipline method, one education system that is going to fit all of them. We must be able to look up and realize that, yes, we are raising 4 children, we are raising 4 individuals. And so we must begin to allow ourselves to stop looking for quick answers and quick fixes, and begin to allow ourselves to see that our unity is not in the same answers, but actually we are united in our questions, not in our answers. And so soul searching, and meaning making about situations is about asking questions. We must allow ourselves to interrogate the system that we have created. But after we have interrogated it, it's not enough to stop there. We must now begin to have a trauma-informed approach to restructuring society. And a trauma-informed approach, what does it say? We must first begin with what is the realization about trauma. and how does it affect people and groups? What are the signs of trauma? Can we recognize them? And then have a system that can respond to trauma. And finally, and this is very important, ensure that the systems, the procedures, the policies we put in place are not re-traumatizing people, but they are actually facilitating healing, and they are facilitating a holistic outlook, bearing in mind that people do have history and trauma.
Asante sana Mweni. Thank you so much for being on our channel, our Facebook Live, and I'm very honored to have you. Darius, closing remark. What's the battle and the hope for the Kenyan soul?
I think we've come a long way. I think it's even important that these conversations are happening in the public sphere, and not just about school fires, even conversations about our national debt and the economic conversation and the sustenance of families and of individuals. I think Kenya, the thing is, we are having these conversations. What I think would be important at this point is we need a more expanded definition of violence. The idea of economic violence as violence, for example, from the resource question or the resource approach which my profession comes from, is something that we haven't really come around to say, when you allow for certain, corruption and looting in a certain way, the implication that has on individual families and the ability to provide for themselves and the ability to take care of their kids and even pay school fees and pay for the damages the schools are imposing on them. There's a whole resource question there and certain inbuilt contradictions and violences that need to be tackled. So one, we need an expanded definition of what constitutes violence in this country, especially the ones that is built into the structures, and procedures of how we do a lot of things in this country. But number two, I think it will be, and that's where Mweni and Dr. Oburu come in, and the people within the education space and the social sciences, to be able to give language to the debates that are going on. I think we are at a good space as a country, given we're already having this conversation. But I think these conversations would be very much enriched if we're able to begin to give the public, to put into the public sphere the language and the concepts and the models with which to begin to grapple with what does it mean to live with systems that do not allow for a healthy feedback loop or feedback mechanisms, whether it's from the kids, whether it's from your juniors, whether it's from the civil service, whether it's from your employees, whether it's from your younger siblings. And so that in a sense we are able to accommodate as many voices as possible in this conversation, but also we are able to have this conversation in a way that is enriching, and it's not one side saying, it's Kababa, this side saying, it's teachers doing this other side is saying it's the parents, but in a way that we're able to equip the public sphere to have these conversations, because they're already having it. It's just, are we willing to guide that into a meaningful end? Yeah.
Asante Darius, thank you for being part of this conversation, and I think we'll have more and more conversations. And also, Darius, you've been on other Msingi talks as well, so you can catch some of the conversations we've had with Darius as well. Daktari, what's the battle and the hope for the Kenyan soul?
When I think about the concept of the Kenyan soul or the soul of a nation, what strikes me most is courage. Courage. So if Kenyans can have the courage to ask the hard questions and to live with the hard answers, and especially in terms of children, to center the needs of the children. The courage to restructure what we think is normal and has been working, but the courage to say, no, we can tear this down, or we can progressively rebuild, okay, so that we create a system that works for children, that inspires them, that is committed to see them grow in a healthy way, and especially to give them a curriculum that they find relevant, a school system that they enjoy, and where they are sure they will grow, they will be nurtured, and there will be a fruitful future for them. The courage to actually do that and commit ourselves that we are going to do this. It wasn't done for you. We have had you. We are trying and to actively go forward and do it. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanna, as you, there's a poem that I want to read as we wind up, because you've spoken about courage and it was shared somewhere. Just give me a minute to find it. Because sometimes this conversations and this work that we're doing sounds and feels very overwhelming. And so, where is it? You know how when you need something at that very time, you can't find it? I think I can't find it in the place where it was, but there's a poem by a Catholic monk that says something around the courage to make a difference. I don't know if you know that poem, but because I can't find it, I will look for it and I'll post it on the chat. But for me, from Msingi, this is a continuing conversation. Please keep sharing this conversation with your friends. Let's have the courage to reimagine. Let's have the courage to build better. Let's have the desire to want better for our children, and to imagine a life and a world that is full of freedom and full of creativity and imagination and flourishing. Because I do not think there is any one of us who desires for our children, for our systems to be one that oppresses. But I think because of our stunted imagination, we just are stuck in Pharaoh's Egypt, and we would it is easier for many of us to say, let's go back to Pharaoh, the Pharaoh we knew. And so I'm asking us to leave Egypt, leave oppression, leave slavery, so that then we can be whole, we can be people again, we can enjoy each other, and we can listen to the laughter of our children. So thank you to all of us. I will end the Facebook Live here.